Well, again, welcome. Take me a second here to kind of switch over from one slide deck to the next, and then we'll get cruising along here. Sweet, looks like we're working. All right, yeah, so welcome. My name's Jeff Bramwell. I work here at Farm Credit Services of America. I lead our solutions architecture team. I've been here for a long time, or it feels like a long time, about 14 years, give or take. Originally started here as a developer, then lead developer, then architect, and now leading the architecture team. Dennis mentioned that we serve exclusively farmers, ranchers, et cetera, et cetera. With lots of careful research, we've determined that farmers and ranchers prefer Azure DevOps. So that's why I'm here to talk about Azure DevOps tonight, because it's the thing. Okay, well, we know who I am. So before I get going, I guess kind of the caveat here is I've done this talk a couple times. This will be the third time I've done this talk in the last few months. And it's essentially an overview of all the things that are in Azure DevOps. I'm sure I miss a few nuances here and there because there's a lot in Azure DevOps. And it's a lot. And trying to get it done in an hour and 15 minutes, give or take, can be a stretch. So I apologize in advance if I start speaking quickly or going quickly. But if I get going too quickly, please, stop me, ask questions, slow me down, tell me to go back and show something, whatever the case is. If you've worked in Azure DevOps a lot, then you'll probably see a lot of things you've already seen or are familiar with. Hopefully you'll pick up something that you maybe aren't familiar with or haven't seen. That's my hope and desire anyway. So that being said, we'll get going. So first of all, kind of like Azure DevOps, so there's the magical word DevOps in there. What is DevOps? And I'm just curious, well, actually, I got a couple questions. So show of hands, who's using Azure DevOps today? So probably close to 2/3 of the group. Nice, very nice. And then I guess out of everybody, who would say they have a DevOps practice today or have implemented DevOps within their organization? So a few, but not nearly as many. Okay, just kind of curious. So when it comes to DevOps, what is DevOps? So to use a particular phrase, this is one that Microsoft tends to use. If you're familiar with Donovan Brown, he's kind of like their face man, if you will, for all things DevOps when it comes to Microsoft technologies. So Donovan likes to say, DevOps, a union of people, process, products to enable continuous delivery of value to your end users. And key there being getting that value to your end users, because in the end, if your users aren't getting whatever it is they're asking for, then what's the point? So this is kind of the working definition that we'll be kind of going off of when it comes to DevOps. So, sorry, gotta move my mouse. So when it comes to DevOps, some companies out there you can consider to be high performance DevOps companies. And so the ones who have been practicing it for a while and have been practicing it very well, there's a few stats here. For example, they have 46 times the deployment frequency of a team that's not performing DevOps type practices. 7 times lower change failure rate, so not bad. A whole lot faster lead time for changes, meaning if you got a change that you have to make, whether that's a bug or maybe just a new feature, if you've had really good DevOps practices, you can get those out really, really fast. And then a whole lot faster mean time to recovery when something does go bump in night. All of this leads to faster time to market, which then ultimately, hopefully if you're in a business to make money, it's increased revenue, which most businesses are in the business to make money. So while DevOps may not naturally translate to the business side all the time, ultimately you can kind of get them there showing various things like this. In the end, the idea is to save money and get things to your customers or your users much more quickly. So tonight we're here to obviously talk about Azure DevOps, and Azure DevOps has a long history of being renamed a lot. So way back when to like Team Foundation Server, Service, and so on and so forth. Visual Studio Online was the most recent incarnation, I guess, and now Azure DevOps until they decide to rename it something else. And so when you think about kind of Azure has a whole lot of things in it, and this is obviously a fraction of the things that Azure itself has available in it. When it comes to Azure DevOps, the tools, we're really focusing down here on the delivering capabilities of things in Azure. Maybe not so much on the operations side or even on the develop side. The develop side's more the Visual Studio, VS Code, things like that. But when it comes time to actually be able to deliver on everything, that's where Azure DevOps comes into play in that Azure space, if you will. So I've mentioned Azure a lot now in the first 3 or 4 minutes I've been talking. So there's always some questions that if people aren't familiar with Azure DevOps that tend to come up. So let's just go through a couple of those real quick. So does Azure DevOps require an Azure subscription? You might think it does, just because it's called Azure DevOps. But no, it doesn't. So you don't actually have to use Azure at all to make use of Azure DevOps. So no subscriptions required. Will Azure DevOps work in non-Microsoft technologies? Obviously, it's a Microsoft tool or set of tools. Microsoft's had this tool a really, really long time, again, in various incarnations. All right, just setting the mood. Yes, it will work with non-Microsoft technologies. It's not tied to just Microsoft technologies, and we'll see a little bit of that as we go through all this tonight. Will Azure DevOps work with AWS or GCP? Obviously, you can assume it works with Azure, and it does, obviously. It works really, really well with Azure, and it's probably the best experience out there for development processes and tooling for Azure. But yes, it will also work with AWS and GCP as well. And then lastly, what about open source software? And this is where Microsoft's kind of made a 180-degree turn over the last, 5 to 8 years, give or take. They used to be very anti-open source, just, very commercial, stay out of the open source area. They make more money, make more money, make more money. Somewhere along the lines, they saw the light, and now they're huge, huge contributors in the open source environment. And yes, Azure DevOps works really, really well with open source technologies. And again, we'll see a little bit more of that as we go through this. So we're going to focus specifically on Azure DevOps, the tools that Microsoft provides. And these are the 5 primary areas that are delivered, if you will, as part of that tool set. The Azure boards, repos, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And we'll kind of go through each of these one at a time. And this isn't just an hour and 20 minutes of slides. It'll be some slides, and I'll bounce into the actual tools. So in case you're wondering, are we going to sit here and watch slides all night long? No, that's not the intent. So Azure boards. If you're not familiar with Azure boards, it's essentially a digital Kanban board, if you will. If you've ever used something like LeanKit or Trello or something along those lines, it's kind of the same thing, but geared toward process or software development processes. So the boards have cards. The cards are really called work items, and work items are essentially those ideas that you have of things you want to build. It's you could even call it like the requirements, if you will, or the user stories. It's those things you want to keep track of that you need to implement along the way. And so the Azure boards allow you to track all of these things. You know what the status is just by looking at the card, seeing what lane it's in, and so on and so forth. They also integrate with different processes. For example, if you do a commit inside of Git or GitHub or Azure repos or GitHub, then you can tie those commits to your work items, for example, so you know that this requirement was implemented via this code and so on and so forth. So there's some neat things like that. It gives you some of the traceability, and we'll see more traceability later on. The boards are based on the process templates. When you create a new project or inside of Azure DevOps, hey, create Jeff's great project, you can select a process template essentially that matches best with what your company's process or development methodologies are. And there's a few out-of-the-box ones, Agile and so on and so forth, but you can also create custom ones if you want to create something custom to match your company's specific needs. It's easy to configure the boards. You can do some neat things like changing colors and so on and so forth. But again, you can track various things over time related to whatever that idea is that you're tracking in the card. And again, I apologize ahead if I'm talking fast, but slow me down if you have questions. All right, so now let's actually bounce in and take a look at some of the boards here real quick, if things are all going to play nicely. And I gotta, oh yeah, let me go back to duplicate. When our screen shut down earlier, it must have reset my screen here. Hey, there we go. So I'm going to be using a couple different demo projects tonight, so you kind of see me bounce in and out of a couple different demo projects, and I'll talk about at the very end of all of this where these projects came from, because you may or may not find that interesting. Through the course of this talk, we'll go through all of these hubs, as they're called, here on the left, and those line up, if you remember, with the slide a few slides ago. You know, we have our boards, repos, pipelines, and so forth, so I'm going to go into boards here. And that's probably really small. Let's see if I can make this a little larger. We'll see how this works on screen resolution. So when you first go into the Boards hub, you're essentially given a list of all your work items. Again, the work items, that's essentially the cards that show up on the board. So this is really just a tabular view of all of those cards. And a work item can be something like a bug or a defect. It can be a PBI or a user story. It can be a test case. If your process has something else, it can be whatever. It can be a task. Pretty much anything your process might have, you can create that type of work item. But for example, this one's just a PBI here. So if I open that up, so you see it's a product backlog item. And it's this kind of stuff you would expect to see. You know, it's got a title, it's got some tags there, it's got the description, so on and so forth, and various other things. You can see history of the card, you know, who's changed what. This one happens to have some links because it's tied to some other things. In this case, this PBI is associated with one bug, a few tasks, and then it has a parent, which is a feature. So you can have, like for example, epics, features, and then PBIs in this particular process template. Different process templates might have different hierarchies. That's how this one's built out. So back up again. So if I go to boards, I'm going to push this over just to get more on here. So this is the actual board view itself. And the resolution makes it a little harder to get it all on the screen up there. But this is kind of what you would expect it to be. So your process is kind of essentially lined up in the column. So we got something over here. These are all new, meaning essentially they've been created, but no one's touched them yet. So you can kind of think of that as your backlog. Something that's been approved, you know, hey, something's in build and test, and eventually it goes over to deployment, it gets deployed. But again, these columns can be whatever you want them to be. That just happens to be how this one's set up. You can drag things around as you would expect, you know, as you're moving it from one status to the next. You know, if I open one of these up, it's going to be essentially the same view we saw a moment ago with the work items. I mentioned this one has epics, features, and backlog items, for example, in this process template. So if you wanted to see all the epics on the board or all the features on the board, you can do that as well. And then you can get cutesy with things. So for example, if I wanted to change the color of a tag, let's say admin, I want all of those to be yellow. And of course I probably picked one. Let me refresh because I see an admin tag there, so it should be yellow. I just need to refresh. And you can color the cards, you can color the tags. So basically you can customize it all kinds of ways to make it suit whatever your team's desires or needs are. So you can look at the board, and the intent is that you can look at the board and at a very quick glance know the status of whatever it is you're working on. And sometimes that's based on the position of the card, where it's at, and sometimes that might be based on color or whatever. So I guess the easy way of saying that is just there's lots of options. You go into backlogs. So if you're kind of in an agile sprint kind of mode where you plan out sprints or iterations, this view is super handy because you have all your PBIs or user stories over here on the left. You can't really see it because of the resolution I'm using now, but the sprints are over here under this what's called iteration path. But if you just look at the number on the end, 6, 3, 4, 4, you know, so on and so forth. So those cards have been assigned to sprints. So if you're in a sprint planning session, so right now over here on the right, we have this little planning lane, and it says that we're currently in sprint 6, so maybe we're going to plan for sprint 7. And so you're in here inside your backlog going, okay, yeah, this one, teams talked about it, we like it, we want that to be in sprint 7, maybe this one as well. And so you can just start dragging things into the sprint to kind of line those cards up. Okay, these are the ones we're going to work on in sprint 7. So pretty simplistic way of quickly planning whatever your next sprint's going to look like. And you can do the kind of similar stuff in here. You can look at, again, PBIs, FX features. There's certain things you can turn on and off. Like, for example, this side pane you could turn off altogether. You can also go what's in like mapping mode, meaning whatever I've selected, excuse me, over here, it kind of lines up the mapping on the right. Typically, you see people leaving that on planning mode. You can also do forecasting, where it'll put a line in here, essentially where, based on all your points and everything you've given it, it says, okay, we're essentially full or planned up to this line. Anything below this line really doesn't fit into the sprint. So it just kind of gives you a visual as part of your planning efforts. There's also something called the sprint board, or the sprint task board. And this is a different view on the board we saw a moment ago. The board we saw a moment ago is all the PBIs, period, that's been kind of pulled in or on the backlog. This board is one that the developers tend to use because it shows basically the PBIs on the left or user stories on the left. And it, for example, this first one here shows me, I'm assigned to that, and these are the 2 tasks that are part of that user story or PBI. And so maybe I've picked up that card and I'm going to be working on this task. And so this is kind of the developer view of things, if you will, inside of the boards. And you can pivot these multiple ways. If we go back over here, right now it's grouped by backlog items, all these PBIs, but you might want to group it by people, for example, if I collapse it over here. So now we've got 4 people working on things, or you can have it by PBI, like I said. So again, just different views all into the same data. And that's a kind of a common theme throughout all of these hubs, if you will, in Azure DevOps. You'll see multiple cases where it's just different views on the same data, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish or what your role is, or so on and so forth. And last thing is queries. And queries are essentially a way of pulling out a list of work items based on some kind of selection criteria. Some will come like canned out of the box, like show me everything assigned to me. So these are all the PBIs that are assigned to me currently. Apparently I've got quite a few. But if I go back and maybe I want to create a brand new query. So creating queries inside of Azure DevOps for work items, it's pretty straightforward. It's a kind of a, not really drag and drop, I guess it's a point and click type thing. So if you create a new one, it's going to by default saying, hey, show me work items of any type in any state. But maybe I want to see all bugs, that have been closed, for example. And then you can add in other clauses, whatever makes sense for you. And I run that, and apparently I picked a really bad one. We have no closed bugs. All our bugs are apparently open. We need to get to work on our bugs. But you can create a query to show me all of the bugs. And then these queries can be used elsewhere, and we'll see this at the very end, but these can be used elsewhere for things like charts and put them on dashboards and do all kinds of cute visuals. You can export these into Excel. Nice thing then is once you export work items into Excel, you can actually do mass updates and things like that in Excel, and then essentially import all of those back into Azure DevOps. So if there's maybe hundreds of work items you need to do some changes to, or whatever the case is, you can kind of go that approach as well. Export, import. I don't use that feature a ton, but I have used it over the years for a few things here and there. So that's kind of the quick version of boards and work. Any questions on this particular part before I jump into the next one? All hopefully makes sense. Sweet. All right. It does, yeah. So I mentioned the process templates a few times. So in those process templates, that's where you define what those work items look like. So like a PBI or a user story or a bug or whatever. But as part of setting that up, for example, you have to say, okay, it has all of these fields. And here's the locations of everything, but as part of that, it has like state transitions in there and what's allowed and what isn't. And essentially, it's what's allowed. Because if you try something that's not specifically stated as, yes, you can go from new to activated or active. If you try to do from like new to closed, well, it wouldn't allow that if you have to go to activated first. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so it does have the capability.
Is there any kind of requesting system built into it too for the non-tech person basically to request something on the tech side, put it in the plan? Or is it left up to the managers to have to rebuild that?
So when you say requesting, I'm not sure if I follow, you mean?
He means adding a DBI.
Oh, just to create one? Yeah, so yes and no. And by that what I mean is, so in Azure DevOps, there's multiple license types for users. And they have a free license type called Stakeholder, which lets them see and do a lot of things. For example, they can create a new work item as a stakeholder. So if, just anybody in your organization that doesn't have any other kind of license type can do that. But there's certain things they can't do. For example, moving cards around on a board. So I think that answers your question. So yes, they can, but it's limited. Unless, of course, you're willing to pay for the license, in which case they can do whatever. But yeah. All right. We'll move on to the repos. So Azure repos. So historically, Azure DevOps, well, prior to Azure DevOps, back when it was called like Team Foundation Server, for many years, all it had was Team Foundation Version Control, or TFVC, which is a centralized version control system, which essentially means all your code lives on one server, and you have to check things out, check things back in, and typically when you check them out, it's locked, no one else can get to it, which has its pros, but it also has its cons. And then several years back, I don't remember exactly what version of TFS off the top of my head, I want to say it was 2012 or 2013, somewhere in there, they implemented support for Git. And so I imagine most people in here are familiar with Git, but Git being a decentralized version control system, which essentially just means there is no central server where it has to live. It's distributed and can live on everyone's computers. You could conceivably have, a file system out there kind of being your centralized Git thing if you wanted to. But obviously Azure DevOps has Git centralized in the sense that you store everything in Azure DevOps, but then that also gets replicated out to all of your dev machines as they clone your repos and things like that. Code reviews via branches, pull requests, and all that stuff supported. Branch policies and all that kind of stuff is there. And easy migration to and from GitHub. That's kind of an easy one to say, because if you're using Git, you can kind of migrate to and from any other Git platform for that matter. That's one of the beauties of using something like Git. But Microsoft supports both TFVC as well as Git. TFVC is essentially hit the point where, yes, they support it, but it'll never see love again, kind of thing. So if you're on it, that's awesome. At some point, they'll probably force you off of it. Don't know when that is, but it'll likely happen. So a few other thoughts around this. So you can think of what Microsoft provides as kind of a highly scalable enterprise class type Git-based system. They put a lot of effort into their Git implementation, and a lot of that stuff they open source, but they created the Git, I think they renamed it, but it used to be like Git VFS, Virtualized File System, Virtual File System, whatever Git VFS stands for. But when they started putting Windows, like Windows the operating system, the source code into their Git, that actually, all of Windows lives in one repo, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And it's just multiple gigabytes of data that comes down when they clone that. So essentially it was almost unusable at that point. So they had to virtualize it to the point where if you're using the Git VFS, yes, it kind of treats everything virtually. It's almost kind of like if you're used to using OneDrive on your laptop, and sometimes the files are only in the cloud, but it looks like they're local, but they're not really. That's kind of like what Git VFS does for Git. It looks like they cloned everything down, but it really only pulled down what they need. But if they try to access something, it'll go grab it, pull it down. So making things a lot more efficient. And then they open sourced that particular product as well. So you can actually use that with GitHub, for example, or any other Git implementation. So they've done a lot of things to make it scalable to really, really large projects, which is really cool. And then put, the usual things like security controls and all that stuff on there. Mentioned earlier on, this is not tied to, Microsoft only type languages or technologies. So pretty much well, I shouldn't say pretty much. If you can develop in a language, well, then you can use Azure repos with that language. It's essentially just that simple. Okay, so let's jump into that and see what that looks like. So I'm going to go back over here, go into Get Repos. No, I don't need to save my work item query. Oh, I need to jump into the other demo project, one that actually has source code would probably be a little more helpful. Excuse me. So when we jump into repos initially, you see what you probably would expect to see, a whole bunch of files and folders, and essentially it's your project structure of whatever you checked in or committed to the Git repo. So nothing too surprising there. We'll go through some of these views. So for example, on history, I'm at the top level of this project. So this would show me the history for that entire project tree. The cute little graph on the left is essentially just your merge graph, just showing you visually that, yep, we had our initial commit down here. Somebody immediately branched it, had a whole bunch of other commits, made a couple commits on the original master branch, and then merged it all back together. That's a simple one, but if you're dealing with lots of branches, lots of developers, those graphs can be super duper helpful when you're trying to figure out, okay, what is where right now? Because that can get confusing sometimes. README, all this is if you happen to put a README file in the root of your project or your source tree, it just kind of brings it out to make it easy to find. I don't know how many people create READMEs for their projects, but if you do, it's kind of sweet because it gives you an easy place to go to learn more about the project. Oops, I'm going to expand this back out. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of times inside of Azure DevOps, it's just different views on the same data. So if I go into commits, for example, this is just a different view on the data we already saw. This is obviously kind of the same. It's showing all the commits for the various branches. But here you can start filtering things out, and getting down into the nitty-gritty of things. If I wanted to see just my commits, for example, or from a particular, date range or whatever the case is. So again, it's just a different view on things. You can go in here, maybe I don't want to see the graph for whatever reason, I don't know. But it's just kind of there to help developers, whittle down and find whatever it is they might be looking for. And pushes, kind of the logical successor to the commits. Hey, I committed all this stuff. Eventually I need to get it back into the source control system. So this is, again, a different view on everything. It's just showing views of the various pushes where the source controls, the source code changes have been sent back up to the server. And branches, this one has 3 branches in it, if I go to it. So if you're familiar with Git, you can create branches off your source code. That might be like, for example, a feature branch. I picked up this work item or this card that wants this feature, and I can actually branch from that card within the card. Say, create a new branch for this thing, and it'll automatically tie that card to the branch. Then you can go off and create your code, do all your testing, whatever the case is, builds and blah, blah, blah. And then eventually you commit all of that stuff back in, and then it merges back together at some point. But the beauty of that is if you create it from the work item itself, it'll automatically tie that to the source code. It gets tied to your pull request in the end with your merge and all of that, which adds to traceability. And we'll see how that traceability gets exposed here in a little bit. So some branches here. And tags, there's no tags in this particular repo, but tags are essentially just a way to, well, literally what it says, tag your commit or source code or whatever at a certain point in time. It's just a way of saying whatever it might be. It might be a version number or whatever the case is. Different teams use them for different things, but version numbers are probably one of the more common things. And finally, one of the probably more useful features out of all of this is the pull requests, or PRs as you commonly hear them referred to. And if you're not familiar with the pull request, What a pull request is, I guess in simple terms, is I cloned someone's repo, maybe it's my team's repo for a project, and I created a branch to go work on some feature or whatever that case is. I get that done, but I don't want to commit that straight back into master, into my master branch, because even though I think I wrote the best code in the world and I never write bugs or anything like that, it doesn't always work out that way. So a pull request, what you do with that is you create a PR or a pull request off of your branch, and then essentially you can specify some reviewers on there, or there might be default reviewers or whatever the case is. And then they'll get a notification, and someone else, some other developer, go look at your pull request and go, yeah, this looks great, and they can approve it and accept it, and then your code gets pulled in, it's merged into master, and life is good. Or they might go, you know what, this doesn't look quite right. Maybe you need to take a look at this area, whatever the case is, and they can reject it. Or it might be somewhere in the middle where they approve it, but they still give you some recommendations on things to look at. So for example, if I go in here, there's one active right now. I'm going to click on that. Hopefully you can see it. So the pull request will show certain things. You know, there's like some comments and things going on here, but if I click on files and scoot this over a little, I've only got one file in this pull request, but when I look at that file, it's going to show me the differences. For example, this is a pretty simple one, like the year 2015 for a copyright changed to 2017 as an example. So I could go, yep, that looks great. I could go up here and, you know, approve it. Or maybe I want to come over here and put a comment in and like, you know, it's, you know, 2019 now. You know, it's no longer 2017, whatever the case is. And then maybe I want to, you know, go back and reject it or whatever the case is. But if I were to approve it, then that's me as the reviewer saying this code looks good, bring it in. But you can do other things. You might want to have two people review it before it's accepted or whatever the case is. You can set up policies, for example, that won't allow anyone to just commit their source code straight in. It'll have to go through a pull request type mode. On those same policies, you can, because some people will game the system, you can also say don't allow someone to approve their own pull request, which kind of goes without saying, but again, that does get gamed if you're not careful. So pull requests are pretty powerful. I would argue that's probably one of the more powerful things in Git. Beyond just the branching itself, but the branching and PRs kind of go together to really make it like a really, really good experience. So if you're not doing pull requests and you're using Git, I would highly recommend looking at pull requests. There's various pull requests or like branching models out there, which might change how you do pull requests and things like that. One that's pretty common, at least, gets talked about a lot is something called Git flow. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum of that is something called trunk-based development. So those are a couple that's worth looking at if you're not going down that path now. If you are and it's working great for you, then that's awesome. Any questions on anything around like Git repos or anything like that in Azure DevOps before I bounce out? Maybe I should have asked this question too. How many folks in here are using Git for your source code repos? And okay, so a few of you are not. Are using TFVC, like Team Foundry Version Control, or something else? Tortoise. You say Tortoise as well, or TFS? Oh, so TFVC. Okay. Thank you.
Do you think it's worth talking about cherry pick?
Yeah. So. Yeah, so cherry picking allowing you to essentially pull specific commits out, if you will. That's what you're getting at?
Or and like we use them for hotfixes.
Oh, for hotfixes, yes. Yeah. Yeah, that is, yeah, I guess you could say that's also a very powerful feature, and that's something that Microsoft's Git rendition or version, whatever, has supported. They just recently put in support inside the Visual Studio IDE as well for cherry picking. But yes, when you're doing hotfixes and things like that, hotfixes can get tricky depending on how you do your branches and what your methodology is and all of that. So you kind of have to really think that through, but that's where cherry picking comes in really handy, as you can get specific as to, yeah, pull this but not that kind of thing based on how your commits are lined up. That's kind of hard to describe without really getting into it graphically. But I would also, yeah, so that's a good recommendation. I would recommend looking into cherry picking as well if you're doing Git. And obviously using pull requests and things like that. Anything else? Okay. We'll keep pressing along. Yes. Oh, sorry. Nathaniel.
Can you handle merge conflicts in ADO?
ADO. Well, I always get thrown off when people say ADO. So Azure DevOps, yes. Yeah. Rebranding in Microsoft, right? I don't know, maybe ADO was before your development experience. I don't know, but so yes, merge conflicts. Yes, you can handle merge conflicts, and you can see that in the PRs. For example, if you go to accept a PR and do the merge, it'll tell you then. Or if you're not doing PRs and you just go straight to do a merge, like you're trying to merge all of your pushes back or your commits back into the master, it will kind of give you that similar experience where you saw the kind of the before and after, if you will, or what's on the server and what's in your particular branch. Or maybe it's just master versus dev or whatever the case is. Yes, it will it will show you those differences and give you options of what to do. You know, you can accept what's in master or override it with what you have or whatever the case is. Or you throw your hands up and walk away and let someone else deal with it. And that's not too uncommon sometimes as well. Does that answer your question though? Okay. All right. So pipelines. So Azure Pipelines, I guess I should have mentioned too a little bit earlier, when they rebranded to Azure DevOps, they renamed several things. And so we had, prior to that, we had builds, like Team Foundation builds. I'm on the wrong thing, and hey, there we go. And years ago, they bought something called release management from, I believe it's called Incycle, Incycle, something like that. Incycle, thank you. And at the time, it was this WPF-based client, and yeah, it was okay, but for the most part, it really wasn't. But then eventually, it turned it into a web-based release tool. And then when they rebranded to Azure DevOps, they combined the two together and just called it Pipelines. So Pipelines is your builds as well as your deployments. If you use the cloud-hosted agents that Azure DevOps provides, they have hosted agents for Linux, Mac, as well as Windows, which is actually pretty awesome. For example, here we do iOS builds for our mobile apps. We do all of those in the cloud. You know, if you rewind a couple of years, we had little Mac Minis, like literally sitting on a desk next to the developer, and that's where we ran all our builds for our iOS products. But once they got the hosted Mac OS thing, it's like, oh, we don't need these anymore. I have no idea what even happened to those. Probably sitting on someone's home desk now. I have no clue. So super handy in that respect. If you're a Windows shop and want to build something for Linux but don't want to manage Linux servers, it's great for that. Or vice versa. Maybe you're a Linux shop and want to build something for Windows but don't want to have Windows servers. The pipelines, again, kind of like mentioned earlier, deal with any platform, any language, any cloud, meaning it can push anywhere. It has native support for Kubernetes, containers, Kubernetes. And I've mentioned this earlier, supports open source, and I would say it's arguably the best in class for open source out there. And as you'll see later, when it comes to pricing and things like that, just, spoiler alert, if you're writing or creating open source projects, pretty much everything you're seeing tonight is just free, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, you can deploy on-prem, go to cloud, or maybe a little bit of both. Staged environment releases, essentially all that means is you can do releases to maybe your development environment, and then maybe a test or a QA environment, and maybe staging, prod, whatever your organization's set up. It can go from one to the next. You can do pre and post deployment approvals with Gates, which is actually pretty cool. We'll see a little bit of what that looks like here in a second. So these are great for projects that span platforms, for example. If you have to create something that maybe you do actually have things running on Linux and Windows and Mac OS, you can have a single build platform and single deployment platform that does all three. You don't have to use this tool for Linux and this tool for Windows and something else for Mac OS or iOS or whatever the case is. You can do it all from one tool. Native integration with GitHub. Obviously with Azure repos, that kind of goes without saying. Since Microsoft acquired GitHub last winter-ish, sometime last year, toward the end of the year, I guess they had $7.5 billion burning a hole in their pocket. But ever since they acquired GitHub last year, they've done a lot of work around integrating pieces of Azure DevOps into GitHub itself. And pipelines is one of those. So if you have something in GitHub, you can use the build and deployment features as well as the Azure Boards features that we saw earlier, all with GitHub. And again, back to Kubernetes. And when it comes to builds, there's a couple different modes of being able to create your build definitions, as they're called. Traditionally, they've had this visual drag and drop user interface. They've had that for years. They also now have the ability to do your build definitions as code via a YAML file. That's relatively new within the last year. They don't have the releases as code yet, but that's coming. So it won't be too long before you can do both builds and releases via code if that's your thing, which there's some definite advantages of doing a code-based approach to your releases and your builds. Shh, quiet. Okay, sorry. Okay, bounce back in here. So let's go down here to pipelines. Yep, I'll leave. I don't need to save my pull request or whatever that was. So if I go in here initially, what I'm looking at, sorry, I'm pausing because my UI has changed. So as of yesterday, you would see builds and releases separately up here. Apparently as of today, you see pipelines as one. I'm going to look at something real quick because I'm only doing this because I'm not familiar with this new layout. If I go into preview features, I don't know if you've played with this part of Azure DevOps much at all, but Microsoft likes to put things out for preview, and when they do, they show up in this preview features, and you can turn things on and off in here, for example. And so what I'm looking for now to see if there is a preview feature around releases and pipelines, and I'm wondering if it might be this multi-stage pipeline. I'm not sure if that's it or not, but we're going to find out. Otherwise, yay, that was it. So if things start changing on you, because Azure DevOps, they have 3-week sprints, so every 3 weeks they're releasing. So things get released pretty quickly and frequently. So every now and then stuff like this happens, where I look at it and I'm like, holy cow, that does not look the same as it did yesterday. And I literally just looked at this yesterday, this particular demo. So anyway, now that we're back to normal here, or at least normal for now, come in, we got our builds initially. This particular project has one build definition, which is this one here, My Health Clinic, E2E or end-to-end. And you can see a little bit of history over here. So this build's been ran 3 times. And the little green check mark, okay, it was successful each time, as an example. I'm going to go in and edit this just to show you what this kind of looks like. This is like a graphical definition. Obviously, this is not using the YAML. But if you're not familiar with the builds, how they're set up, it's similar to like Jenkins. If you've ever used Jenkins, it's kind of the same notion or same idea. You have a bunch of build tasks, and as you pull in the build tasks to accomplish whatever it is you need to do for a part of a build, and you essentially compose those. So when I look at these, for example, this build definition has a restore here. This is doing a NuGet restore, so the very first thing it does, well, technically the very first thing it does up here is it gets the source code. In this case, it's getting the source code from an Azure repo, but there's other options here for where your source code might live. In this case, it's all in Azure repos. But then it's going to go down to a NuGet restore, does an npm install. And apparently this one also uses Bower, so it's kind of, as well as Gulp, so it's kind of going all over the place. I didn't create this project. Again, this is a demo, and I'll show you at the end where these things came from because you might find it interesting. But eventually it gets to the point where it's actually building your code. So in this case, it's running this build task, and for example, if we look at the parameters on the right, each one of these might have different parameters depending on what the task is. Probably not too surprising. Then okay, we built our code. Now let's test our code. Again, similar type of parameters. Eventually we get to the publish, which essentially just packages everything together. Publish our test results, and all that means is pushing the test results back into Azure DevOps, so you can kind of get a nice view and history of what the tests have been doing, and so on and so forth. In this case, we're also copying some files out to the artifact staging directory, and then this last task here is publishing the artifacts themselves. So after everything's been built, tested, and then quote unquote published or compiled, if you will, then it publishes them as an artifact, and we'll look at artifacts at the very end, but there's a quote unquote artifact store, if you will, in Azure DevOps. And when it gets to the release pipelines, that's where it can go to pick up whatever it is you're trying to release is out of that artifact store. So that's kind of what those look like. Now, if I wanted to, for example, add a new task in here, click on the little plus sign over here, and then over on the right, and that might be kind of hard to see, but right now it's on, I got everything selected, and you get the list of all the tasks that are available, that are out there, and just about anything you can think of, it's got. I'm not going to scroll through them all because there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tasks available out there. Some of them are kind of out of the box, if you will, meaning that they're just by default available. But a lot of them are out in their marketplace, the Visual Studio Marketplace. And so you can go to the marketplace directly and look at them and then, install them if you like. But you can also install them directly from here. If it's something that's in the marketplace, it'll just kind of walk you through that process. They've got some categories, for example, these are all tasks that are build tasks or related to build processes, or maybe there's some that are just utilities, tests, so on and so forth. One of the interesting one though is over here, something called it's called tools, but it's essentially they're called tool installers. And what these are useful for, especially if you're using the hosted agents, the ones that Microsoft provides out there in the cloud somewhere, is, for example, maybe you want to do, maybe you're using Go, right? The language Go. Well, by default, Go may not be available on your build agent. The binaries for compiling your Go source code and all of that. Well, if you have, 20 build agents, which is, I think, how many we have here. We have on-prem 20 build agents. You can either go install all the Go binaries on all of those agents or all of those servers manually, or maybe you want to script it somehow, whatever the case is. Or you can come in here and say, you know what, let's add this tool installer to our build. I'm going to drag it up to the top because typically these things go to the top. Yep, I didn't do a very good job of dragging though. Not a good dragger. Oh well, close enough. But then depending on the type of tool installer, you got some parameters like this one says, okay, what version of Go do you want to use? 1.1, okay, that's perfect. That's the version I want. And that's it. When you run your build, it's going to go out, pull down that version of Go, install it on that server, and then execute the rest of your build process. I don't have to go install that. And where we use that today, for example, is with Java stuff. We have a few, even though we don't write code in Java, we use some tools that require Java, like whether that's JMeter or whatever the case is. Rather than us trying to keep Java up to date on all of our build servers, we can just use the Java tool installer. Java is one of the ones that was there other than Go, and there's Ruby out there and so on and so forth. So we don't have to keep that up to date. And then if you're using the hosted agents, that's really your only choice because you don't have direct access to those hosted agents. You can't go and log in and install stuff and then use them. That's not an option. So you have to go this route. So that's actually a really cool feature. I mentioned the YAML builds. The YAML builds are still, like I said, still relatively new. So maybe you want to kind of cheat because maybe you don't understand or haven't memorized all the YAML syntax yet, for example, when you're trying to do a build. So if I wanted to, for example, say, hey, I want to take, get down here to my agent. I don't know, pick your favorite one. I'll pick the restore or whatever. And why am I not seeing it? Oh, maybe because I'm in a, sorry, I'm mumbling because I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. clicking, but it's not playing nice. I'm gonna refresh. Sorry. Oh, was I not seeing it? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I was expecting it to be in the context menu. Maybe it used to be and they moved it, I'm not sure. But you can do this for like all tasks at once through that, selecting that agent one, for example, or whatever you've named that job or agent job. Or you can do this task by task. But in this case, I selected everything, so it's giving me the YAML for that entire build definition, if you will. And then you can copy and paste whatever you like into your YAML build definition. So it's kind of just a quick way of taking something you have done graphically and getting it in. For example, if I had just done one of these, I stand corrected, they've actually removed it. Used to be you could do this one-off as well. So I guess they're...
It looks like you can scroll to the side.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Hey. Thank you. Always love it when the crowd can help out. It makes it much better. Thanks. So yeah, you can do one at a time as well as all of them. They've started making some changes to the YAML editor as well. Now when you create a YAML-based build, like for example, let's just go and create a new build here. Matter of fact, by default now, it tries to force you down the YAML path when you create a new build. You got to come down here and say use the classic editor if you want the drag and drop cutesy UI type thing. That's the direction they're moving anyway. But let's just go in here, for example. Yep, quickly running through all of this. And so when you come in, you see a whole bunch of YAML. So it's not nearly as helpful as what you get on the drag and drop side. But they've got some stuff, I thought I saw it in preview, it must be an early preview, where they've got kind of a graphical editor on the right that essentially shows you those build tasks that you can use. And you can drag those into your YAML editor and it just kind of blows in the text, the YAML text itself. So it gives you a little bit of help. But what they don't have is kind of a round trip, meaning I started in graphical, I want to go to YAML, but there's no way to go back to graphical. And I don't know if they'll ever add that or not, but that does not exist today. But the beauty of YAML files is that in this case it's a build, it becomes part of your source code. So, and the beauty of that is then it lives in whatever branch you have. So if you need to create a new branch because you got this brand new feature, your build definition comes along and then maybe you have to add in 2 or 3 steps or maybe remove some steps, whatever the case is based on the feature you're building. You could still have your master branch running the old build because it's still in code, but then your new branch that you created can have a completely different build and it'll work independently of the others. You can't do that with the graphical builds. The graphical builds, typically what you've had to do up until then was just make a copy of it. And okay, maybe let me run this build for this branch and this build for that branch. But when you do it as code, it just kind of comes along for the ride with your branch, which is super nice. Actually, before I run into releases, I wanted to show one thing as well. I'm going to click on one of these builds that I've already ran. So all this build, everything succeeded. You can kind of go in and for each task you can view the logs, get all the details and stuff. I don't think this one has any tests, so there's nothing really fun here to see in the test tab. But the one that's kind of neat to see is the summary one. So I mentioned kind of the traceability of things. And so for this particular build, if we go look and we're like, what's in this build? Well, down at the bottom, it's to show you, okay, it started out with this one work item, add contact us to the web app. So that's the work item. That was the business requirement, which then eventually turned into multiple, well, in this case, one commit, but it could have been multiple commits. So it turned into these commits. A build was manually queued, apparently by me. The build succeeded. There were no tests for this particular build. Those artifacts got published, like we saw in the build definition. It attempted to deploy to dev, but then the deployment failed. So you can see end to end where an idea and a work item ultimately lands, hopefully assuming the deployment would have succeeded. That, yep, it landed out here, and you can get really granular down to, and it landed on these servers, for example. So when someone says, hey, is this particular work item in prod, you can definitively say yes or no pretty quickly. And that's one of the really, really powerful things about using an overall integrated suite of things like Azure DevOps. And a lot of this traceability also works with GitHub. Like I said, they put a lot of tie-ins to GitHub, so that might have been an issue in GitHub, for example, and you'd see the same type of traceability coming through here.
Just in the last couple of weeks, they added code coverage, where if you publish code coverage,
Yes.
you can actually browse through your source and see what's covered, what's not covered, and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the code coverage piece, yeah, it's really nice as well. And I suspect they'll continue to keep highlighting things that just make it better, for that end-to-end traceability and seeing what's actually going on and digging in and things like that. On the releases look very similar to the builds. This one's had 3 attempts. Matter of fact, all 3 of these releases have failed. And that's because I haven't bothered to go in and configure all the Azure settings, because it's attempting to deploy to Azure. And the settings just aren't all configured correctly for this particular demo project. That doesn't mean we can't look at it and see what a release looks like. So like I mentioned earlier, you can't really do the YAML builds or the YAML releases today, but you can do the graphical. So this is what the release pipeline would look like. And so you've got your artifacts over here I mentioned earlier. That's kind of the source of what it is you're trying to deploy. And then you have your stages on the right. So in this case, we got dev, QA, and prod. So it'll try to go through dev, and if that succeeds, then you can tell it to go to prod, or you can automatically, or to QA, or you can automatically send it to QA, and so on and so forth down the line. If it fails somewhere along the way, then you're stopped there. If I click on dev, now this UI is pretty much identical to the build UI. We now have, tasks, just like we had on our build side. If I attempt to add one, you're going to see if I can actually click it, you're going to see the same UI over here. All those same tasks you saw on the build, you can put into your deployment essentially. So it's a very, very familiar way of setting up your pipelines or your tasks for each environment. I mentioned earlier kind of some of the gates. So on the left and right of each of these stages, you can click on these and do certain things. So for example, we got a trigger here for after release, after stage, manual only. You can do all kinds of neat things here, and I won't go through all of these, but essentially you can do things like on the pre-side, like maybe I want to schedule a release, or maybe I need a manual approval of a release. And you can say, okay, this has got to go to Bob Smith. He has to approve it, or maybe it's some group, and somebody in that group has to approve it. Once they approve it, then the pipeline kicks off again and keeps going. But you can also do certain things like, and it's down here in these gates, for example. But you can do some interesting things down here as well. It's like checking Azure policy compliance. So what you can do is you can deploy out to maybe like one server that, or one node or whatever that no one has access to yet. And then you can check things like Azure compliance. Is this thing actually, compliant with whatever my policy settings are? You can invoke Azure functions and do other things, or REST APIs. Maybe you want to test something. Once it actually gets deployed, you want to actually do some kind of test. Hey, can I actually get to whatever it is I just deployed? Those kinds of things. And if those things fail, then you've got options to roll back or whatever the case is. So you can do some pretty neat things, which is super helpful when you're trying to obviously automate your entire DevOps pipeline. And then on the other side, same idea, it's just fewer options. So the first one is things that run essentially before that stage is really complete, and the other one runs after the stage is complete. Does that make sense, I hope, on those kind of pre and post gates for deployments? Again, like super powerful for using those types of things. These other things are not quite as interesting, but we'll kind of just quickly touch on them. So under libraries, so you have variable groups, secure files. These are things that your builds or releases, essentially your pipelines can share across multiple pipelines within the same project. Same with task groups. Deployment groups, maybe you want to deploy to some environment, and I'll say prod, but maybe your production environment has, an 8-node cluster. Well, rather than deploy to node 1, then node 2, then node 3, then node 4, you can set up deployment groups and actually deploy to multiple nodes essentially concurrently. So just making things a little nicer, and there's various other patterns you can use and things like that. Last one is XAML. Previous to these builds, I don't know if anybody remember it. Well, some of you are in TFS, you're still using the XAML builds then, likely, right? The XAML builds have been deprecated. If you create a new project today, typically you won't see XAML, but if you have a legacy project that had XAML builds, they'll still show up. And the XAML builds were all you had for, I don't know how many years, like 10 years or whatever it was, quite a while. Until they finally came up with the new look and feel, which is a huge, huge improvement over what there was. Any questions on pipelines? Makes sense, hopefully. Pipelines are super, super powerful, and that's really where the rubber meets the road, if you will, because what comes out of the pipeline is what your customers see, your end users. And so that's what really makes it all worth it in the end, is being able to actually deliver all of the other stuff you worked on prior. Artifacts, I mentioned this earlier. So there's essentially like an artifact store. You're likely familiar with like NuGet packages or NPM packages and things like that. So you can store all of those things inside of Azure DevOps. I know here we create quite a few NuGet packages. We don't create as many NPM packages, but we have a ton of custom NuGet packages. Excuse me. You can also aggregate from public registries. This is actually a relatively new feature, but it's been around several months. So essentially, you might tell your developers to only use Azure DevOps to get your NuGet packages, as an example. But then Azure DevOps might also source from a public NuGet, like NuGet.org, NuGet store out there. And then if I go request something, whatever that might be, I don't know, Newtonsoft, the NuGet package, Azure DevOps says, I don't have it. It'll go out to the public store, grab it, bring it down, cache it in Azure DevOps, and then give it to you. Then the next person that grabs it, that same version anyway, will just get it out of Azure DevOps. And where that can be useful is if a developer wakes up one day and says, I'm really tired of supporting this open source project and all this NuGet package, and I'm just going to go delete my NuGet package from these public stores or whatever. If you didn't have this cache somewhere, you'd be like, oh crud, my project's dead now. I can't compile, I can't pull down the NuGet package because it no longer exists. So this is kind of that buffer for that as well. It's good for build performance because it's going to help speed up your builds a little bit because it can cache things closer to where your builds happen. But it also gives you that extra level of security or protection of, it wasn't that long ago, for example, where a developer, I believe, did delete an NPM package, right? And I don't know, broke half the internet or whatever it was. If you were using Azure DevOps in that scenario today, that wouldn't be an issue if you were caching at the Azure DevOps level. Yeah, great for use. You can create all kinds of feeds. So this one, rather than going to demo, I just thought I'd show you what it looks like. This is actually our artifacts here at Farm Credit Services of America. A whole bunch of NPM packages that we've pulled down, tons and tons and tons. If I were to filter by FCS America, for example, we tend to put FCS America in the names of our custom NuGet packages. So all of these are ones that we created. So we have all kinds of NuGet packages that we've created and published out there. So that our various development teams and projects make use of. And again, you can create all kinds of feeds. You can limit permissions for various things. If I go in here and look at feed settings, for example, upstream sources, we're sourcing our NPM packages publicly, but then we're caching them. I don't know why we're not doing that for NuGet packages. We probably should be, but we're not apparently from the looks of it. But if one of our NPM packages got deleted publicly, we'd at least still be able to build, so it wouldn't be an issue. From the looks of it, though, if we lost a NuGet package, that'd be a different story. So something to think about tomorrow when I come back to work. But finally, Azure test plans. So this is one area of Azure DevOps that for a while saw a little love and then hasn't seen a love in a long time. But so test plans is essentially a way of organizing all of your test plans, test suites, test cases, and all of that stuff. And essentially those are all tracked via work items, those cards, and you can, like you would see in the Kanban boards and things like that. And then you can essentially go through and manually run these test cases. It's not for automating test cases, it's for manually running test cases. So it's, like manual regression testing is probably a really good, use case for this. But it will also, as you're doing this, you can say when things fail or whatever, and it'll capture all of that. You can create bugs, for example, if something fails. And let's just take a quick look at that one real quick. Make sure I get in the right one. So that's the, whoops. Click on the right thing here. So I've mentioned once again that this is just yet another view on data that's already in there. So in this case, we're showing like test cases. So these are really cards, but the type of card is a test case. And then test suite, sorry. Then we have all of our individual test runs and things over here for each test. And probably the best way of explaining this is just to show it. So if I say run with web application, what it's going to do is bring up a test runner. And essentially it's follow the instructions. It says, this test case, for example, is verify that a notification is auto-closed, so it tells you what to do. Click the notification icon. Yep, that worked great. It did what it said, so I say it worked great. Go on to the next and wait for X seconds, whatever that means, with the notification window open, expect a result, blah, blah, blah. But maybe I say, you know what? That one didn't work. I say, didn't, can't type, work, whatever. Then ultimately I can go up here, I can create a bug. I can add it to an existing bug. And if you go create a bug, it's going to capture, that first one passed, but the second one didn't. Hey, the comment is that it didn't work. So it's essentially just a way of organizing all of your manual tests is really what it boils down to. And I'm just going to bounce out of that. Now, there was a time where they also supported what they called cloud load tests, but we don't talk about this anymore because they've deprecated it. So it's still there. They'll support it for, I think, till roughly the middle of next year. I can't remember the exact time frame, and then it goes away. Which, kind of sad. We actually today use this here for a few scenarios. We built something that internally we call Lightning Proxy, which is essentially a proxy server, is all it is. But we wanted to make sure that it could handle, large amounts of traffic. So we use cloud load tests against that, and these things run. I think they run daily, just to make sure that any changes that might come in isn't slowing things down. So now we're going to have to change that. We'll have to go to something else, whether that's JMeter or some other tool out there. The reason they're getting rid of it, though, is if you read their blog post, if you skip all the fluff words, basically it says nobody's using it. So that's the real reason they're getting rid of it. So we use it, but apparently we might be the only ones. So if you thought you might want to use load testing in Azure DevOps, you can still do load testing. You just have to integrate with different tools now. There's no tool out of the box for doing load testing in Azure DevOps, which is kind of a bummer. So I can't really show the Qt charts on the one I have because the demo didn't have any, but you can get all kinds of neat, eye candy type charts and things out of your testing, just to kind of show where things are, if things are improving, maybe they're not improving, whatever the case is. So some of the other stuff that we didn't look at. So we've looked at all of these hubs here on the left. The one we didn't look at was the very top one. The very top one, if I go to that, for example, it's going to give you a kind of a default out-of-the-box summary, if you will, of your project that you created. And so you can put stuff in here, like what's this project about, or whatever verbiage you want. People can like your project. If you're into that sort of thing, I don't know that anyone's ever clicked like on any of our projects, and I don't know, we have a couple 100+ projects, maybe somewhere someone clicked it, I don't know. It'll kind of give you an auto-generated idea of what languages are in this project. So in this case, we got JavaScript, TypeScript, and some Sass type stuff going on. And it does that just automatically because it's indexed all your source code with Elastic behind the scenes, so it can kind of pull some of that stuff out, give you a few project stats on the right. So it's not an overly exciting page, to be honest. But you can also create dashboards, and I'm actually going to zoom back out on this one. So this dashboard obviously is demoware, because I'm not sure anybody would create a dashboard quite this busy, or at least hopefully not, right? But it does give you a general idea of the kinds of things that you can put on the dashboard, and you can create multiple dashboards. So maybe you have one geared toward a particular project, or one geared toward a development team, or maybe one's just builds, or one's releases, whatever you can dream up essentially. So that's probably true, yes. Yeah, there is somebody that has a dashboard just like this. But yeah, so there's all kinds of widgets that are available. Again, some are out of the box, if you will, but there's a ton of them out in that Visual Studio Marketplace that you can pull down, or you can create your own. All of this stuff we're looking at tonight is all extensible. So everything in the marketplace is either A, been put there by Microsoft themselves, or B, by contributors out of the community. So there are tons and tons of things out there. The analytics views maybe isn't quite as interesting to a lot of people. Analytics views is relatively new, and essentially what that is a way to set up kind of like a data feed in Azure DevOps that will feed into Power BI. And today I believe all they have exposed is work item data. But if you want to slice and dice your work items 9 ways to Sunday through Power BI and all the power that it brings, you can create analytics views inside of Azure DevOps and then tie Power BI directly to that, and then just go to town. I know they have plans to also add the pipeline data through analytics views. It's just a matter of time when that happens. And that's probably where it gets more interesting, honestly, is in the pipelines data. When you're talking about things like, all of those mean times to failure and all that fun stuff. And then lastly, this is a pretty boring one, but wikis. Azure DevOps actually has a pretty decent wiki experience. This wiki is pretty boring because it's empty. But it's what you would expect out of a wiki. It's all markdown based. You can add pages, folders, images, blah, 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 all the stuff you would expect to have. Wikis actually do get utilized, or at least here, quite a bit. Typically it's they are project based, but typically it's, here's what the project is about, or maybe there's a support page and support information for who to contact, or whatever the case is, or maybe it's your developer machine setup type instructions. Hey, I'm going to build this project for the first time. What do I need to know? It's that kind of stuff. And might be even like team notes. Whatever you can dream up for a wiki, it can handle. So, kind of getting to the end of this, DevOps at Microsoft. So obviously Microsoft likes to eat their own dog food, to use their term. So they have over 100,000 internal users, which is just a couple more than we have, give or take, yeah. But so for example, 442,000 pull requests per month, a few million builds a month, and so on and so forth. This is as of March, so just a few months ago. Deployments per day. Anybody want to take a guess on deployments per day throughout Microsoft? Just a wild guess. What's that? 10,000? Somewhere in between. 82,000. So every day, 82,000. I have not done the math, but I'm guessing that's, a few a second or something. I don't know. It's a lot. It's more than we do. But so yeah, that's and the real point of showing a slide like this is if you have ever wondered, will Azure DevOps scale to whatever your organization is? Odds are it will. So odds are. Mentioned pricing a little bit earlier, free for open source projects. So if it's an open source project, it's free for unlimited users. as well as build time. Not only is it unlimited build time, but it's 10 parallel jobs, which essentially, so you could have multiple people, up to 10 people running 10 builds at the same time, which is actually pretty cool. The Azure boards and all that's included, as well as unlimited public Git repos. And so that's on the GitHub side. Azure DevOps also has public repos, public Azure repos, so that is an option there as well, but most people would be in GitHub if you're doing open source projects. So really, really sweet deal if you're doing open source projects. If you're a small team, meaning 5 users or less, it's also free. It's just some of the times and things are limited. So in this case, you only get one job at a time, or 1,800 minutes a month, which comes out to roughly an hour a day of build time on the hosted agents. You get the boards and repos as well as artifacts. Artifacts, I don't think those are a thing in GitHub yet, but give it time. Yes, I'll leave it there. And of course, if you're larger than that, which probably most teams are, then yeah, you got to start paying at some point, because at some point Microsoft has to pay for all this stuff they're building, and that's how they do it, is through subscriptions. And pricing will vary depending on how many people you have, or if you have Visual Studio subscriptions, well, then you start getting licenses for that, and that's where it gets all confusing. And that's where we let our procurement officer deal with all of that, because no one understands what Microsoft is doing most of the time when it comes to licensing. I'm just going to throw up a couple informational URLs here, and I can share these slides too. But so if you've ever wondered, can Microsoft tooling or Azure DevOps do this? Well, they've got this pretty neat website out there for customer stories that you can go to and type things in, like here in this screenshot, Azure DevOps. And it'll bring up all of these case studies they've done with various companies out there that's used Azure DevOps, and maybe they've used it on Linux, or maybe they used it with Java, and you're just trying to understand, well, can I use it for my scenario? And so that's a really great resource for finding out other companies that have done maybe what it is you're trying to do, which is really cool. Mentioned the marketplace a few times. Yep, definitely visit the Visual Studio Marketplace. Again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of extensions out there. There's just lots of them. Some of them are build extensions. Some of them are widgets like for the dashboard. Some of them are other extensions for various things. For example, like tags. You can do tags and work items, but there's no inherent way of like renaming tags or deleting tags. But there's an extension for that, which we actually have installed here. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but we have it. If you ever come across it, it's like, oh yeah, that's through an extension. That's not native out of the box. So a lot of neat functionality out there. I've mentioned the demos a few times. So there's something out there called the Azure DevOps Demo Generator. And if you go to this site, you sign in with whatever your Microsoft account or your Azure AD account is that you might want to use with Azure DevOps. And then it'll give you a choice of, I don't remember how many there are, there's 6 or 8, give or take, different types of demos. One's Java-based, they've got some mobile-based ones, and then some .NET Core-based ones, and so on and so forth. And then you tell it what Azure DevOps organization or account you want to use, and say go, and then a few seconds later, you've got a full-blown project blown out into Azure DevOps. So those demos I was doing tonight, both of those are from this demo generator. So it creates the source code, the work items, the builds and releases, all of that stuff in a matter of seconds. So if you aren't too familiar with Azure DevOps, or maybe you are and you just want to play around, it's a great way of getting projects set up that actually have content in them, rather than starting empty and trying to just add things to see how things work. So super, super helpful site. And finally, we're done. So, any questions?
On your pricing page for the small teams, I think it said that it was public Git repos. It's actually unlimited private repos on the small teams.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's something that changed not too long back, actually. For the private Git repos, I mean. Yeah. Or I'm thinking of the GitHub side, but yes. I'll fix that. Thank you. Yep.
Is there a place to do Scrum, like back views of the scrum of the sprints, reflections.
Oh, you mean like a retro?
Yeah,
Is that what you're
retros.
getting at? No, there is nothing inherent for retrospectives inside of the tools.
There are extensions that
That
support that.
yes. So if you got to that marketplace, you can find things. That, yes, that will support that, but not out of the box. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, Steve, I actually was playing with Azure DevOps, and we had a secure server that we didn't want anything pushed to. But we learned that you can go ahead and they have, I think we were working with deployment groups, and there's an option there that you can go ahead and have a polling service put on Facebook. I thought it was really cool. So it just polls for updates of software, you know, if you're trying to, you know, deploy to a secure server.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and there's lots of things you can do too inside of the pipelines and whatnot around permissions, around who can do what, or who can even kick off a build to begin with, and who can actually do a deployment and to which environments, and so there's all kinds of granular controls to help control some of that as well as the polling on that, which super helpful. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you internally get a lot of use out of the manual test plans?
Um,
I'm a quality engineer and I never use them.
I don't know if I'd call it a lot. I know of one team, and we have, well, we're
12?
changing, but we're at 12. Yeah, thank you. So I'm at 12 teams now. I know of one that's made use of the manual tests. And that's it. So I wouldn't say a lot, no.
Cool.
Yeah,
Just want to make sure I wasn't the crazy one.
not alone. Yeah, not alone. All right. Anything else? All right.
I had
Oh,
one, but
yes.
it's not related to DevOps.
Oh.
But has anyone ever tried moving your DFS, your code from DFS to Git? And how was that experience? And are there any issues or stuff like that? Because DFS has been giving us a lot of problems lately, and we were just thinking about it.
So you talking about, when you say TFS, you mean Team Foundation Version Control, like the centralized version control?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the transition of the code from
Mhm.
DFS to Git, and have you ever, like with history and everything, have you ever found, had any issues with that, or how was that experience, if anyone has done that?
We've done that here, but I'm curious to see if anyone else has.
Yeah.
Gone through that.
We did that before.
So it was a smooth transition?
Not excuse me, not entirely smooth. We wanted history, but there was so much history, it's a lot of information to move. So we ended up finding, I think it was a third-party tool to help with that migration, to get it uploaded to the server. We had issues with line endings, all kinds of weird one-offs. So it wasn't entirely smooth, but it ended up working out.
Okay.
I was super adamant about him bringing over history, and I never used it, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know here we had, I think it's about 120 projects at the time that we migrated, but we went through each one and asked, once we determined which team actually owned that project, we asked, do you want history as a question? And then we also asked, do you want the work items? Because in a lot of cases, the work items were closed years ago. It's like, do we need to migrate all of those? But then, yeah, we came up with the manual steps to do it, which didn't take that long for each project. There was just a bunch of them, so we ended up hiring a contractor, and that's just what he did for close to a month, I think. Just every day cranking through migrations, but eventually got them done. So it was fairly smooth. To be honest, we ran into very few glitches. The other question we asked was, do we even need this project anymore? We ended up just dropping quite a few of them because no one uses this. No point in migrating it. Yeah,
Thank you.
great question. Any other questions? All right, turn it back over to Matt.